In Proverbs chapter 3, we read these words. Proverbs chapter 3, it says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. And don't lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Developing a culture of trust. A few weeks ago, we were in Fireland. I'm standing at the front here and we're worshiping. The worship team went into this song. This is my desire to honor you. And then it goes on to the chorus. And the chorus goes like this. It says, "Lord, I give you my heart and I give you my soul. I live for you alone. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake. Lord, have your way in me. Lord, I give you my heart and I give you my soul." And as I stood there and I'm worshiping and I'm singing the song, God took me back to a time in my life when I didn't trust him. God kind of transported me back to a moment in my life where I didn't trust him. I loved kind of last week at Cafe Church, I loved listening to other people's stories. And I loved listening to Rosa and to Rodney and sharing their story. And then I loved listening to Sarah. Sarah is phenomenal. And these guys were leading us in worship. And Sarah was sharing a portion of her story and singing a couple of songs. And it's kind of strange how that, Rodney was sharing about how that he was in the U.S. Army and in the time of the Iraq War, and he finds himself in of all places, the back garden of Saddam Hussein. And it's there, and he's sitting, and he's kind of crying out to God because he wants his gun to be replaced with a guitar. And he explains in his story how that the chaplain turns up with the guitar and goes straight to Rodney and says, "Rodney, this is for you." And then Sarah is sharing her story, and she's sharing how that she spent about 7 months or so in a psychiatric ward in Belfast. And she's going through this process of a bit of a mess, and Rodney, the same thing, in this messy situation. And it's in that pain that God meets with them. It's in that pain that they kind of discover a new realm of God, and God will use our pain to take us to his promise. It's in our pain that we will find his purpose. And so I loved listening to stories like that and how that God has kind of come through and has brought people through some stuff. But what happens whenever it seems to take forever for God to do something? What happens whenever we're going through stuff and we feel like God isn't there? And maybe it's not even that God isn't there. It's that God has in some way turned his back on us, and that God is in some way no longer interested in our pain, no longer interested in our story. And as I stood and as I worshiped and as we began to sing that song, God transported me back to a time when I was going through pain. And whenever I failed to trust God, because the length of time went on for years. Part of my story and how that I began to question my purpose and my identity and my reason for being on this earth. Around about the age of 14 was whenever this kind of began, 14 in third year, and it began so simple. In third year, we would pick subjects for our GCSEs for fourth and fifth year. And I didn't know what subjects to choose, and the teacher would just say, "Listen, choose the subjects based on what you want to do with your life, on what you want to do after you leave school." And for the first time, I began to think about my life. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to become, what I wanted to be. I hadn't got a clue. And I've been asked to make these decisions based on your future. And I ended up coming, slowly but surely coming to this conclusion that there's not really a point to me being on this earth. There were various other things that were taking place, but I don't want to go into them at the minute. What was happening with me was that I had come to a place where it was dark. There were dark circumstances, and I was questioning God, and I believed that God was no longer interested in me. And I would put him to the test. I wouldn't even know I was put him to the test. Because I had always had this belief in God. I had never doubted that God existed. I've always believed that God existed. That God was a loving, caring God. That Jesus died, that he rose again. I had never doubted that for 1 second. But I began to doubt that he was interested in me. Around about the late 80s, early 90s, there were a lot of youth meetings that were taking place. Hillsborough Bible Week had just kind of started around about the late 80s. And then there were these youth meetings that began to take on a life of their own. And God was doing amazing things among the lives of a lot of young people at that stage. And the move of the Holy Spirit was just incredible. And a lot of young people were getting touched by the Holy Spirit and by what was taking place. And around about the kind of very late 80s and early 90s, I knew that the darkness that I was going through, that the only person that could help me was God. I knew that I needed an intervention of God. I needed a breakthrough of God in my life. And so many young people, because what was happening was, these were good meetings that were taking place. And people were going up and getting prayed for, and they were falling down in the Spirit, and then they were laughing and joking, and it was good. It was an amazing atmosphere. But for me, it wasn't fun, because I desperately needed a touch of God. And so I would go up to get prayed for. And as I went up, I actually came away worse off, because as I came up to get prayed for, nothing was happening and nothing was changing. And I was desperate, desperate for God to move in my life. And he wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was, to me, uninterested. And the moment that God took me back to those a few weeks ago was a time in the old stadium. And there was a youth meeting that was taking place in the main hall. And I was just so desperate. I was probably around about 15, 16 years of age. And there was this war that was taking place within me. And I mean, there was a war going on within me that nobody knew about. Nobody had a clue what I was going through, because I would just keep it all in, and I would keep it all to myself. And I knew, God, I need you to move, because I'm dying inside. If not, I'm already dead inside. There is this war, there is this struggle, there's this turmoil that is taking place that is ripping me apart from the inside, and I need you to move. And the moment that God took me back was that time up in the stadium, and I was a mess. And I was bawling my eyes out, and I was crying, and I was actually punching a chair, the old plastic chairs that I had up in the stadium. I was punching the chair, and I was like, God, I need you to move. God was silent. God was silent. And as I stood there in Fireland a few weeks ago, God took me back to that particular moment in time when I was struggling to trust him, because I felt like God had disowned me, that God wasn't interested in me, and therefore I didn't trust him. I didn't trust that he was the loving God that we've been singing about, that he was that good Father that we've been singing about. And it was kind of crazy, because this was kind of like the war that was going on within me, because I knew, God, you are a God of love. You did send your son to die for me, but why are you not speaking to me? Why are you not moving in my life? All these other people are coming and blessed. They're falling down in the Spirit. They're laughing. They're joking. You're moving in their lives, and I'm not looking for that. I just need you to speak to me. I need you to move in my life. I need an intervention. I need a breakthrough, and yet you are silent. And other things then began to take place that made things worse. And the more that I went up to get prayed for, the worse I became. Because every time that I went up, nothing was happening. And then I began to war with myself and saying, right, well, what's the point in going up and getting prayed for whenever I know what's going to happen anyway? Because God's not interested. And I'll go back to my chair, deflated, disappointed, disillusioned, becoming more and more cynical about God, about church, about everything. And I desperately needed God to move, and my trust in Him began to wane and began to fall by the wayside. God transported me back to that moment, and I believe that He was sharing with me that there are people in this place, and you're beginning to struggle to trust God. That as we sing songs like that, I give you my heart. Why should I give you my heart, God, when it's being messed up and torn apart? I was still going to meetings, and I was still like trying to get an answer from God, because deep inside I knew that God was the only one that could actually do something about what was going on in my life. And the longer that it went on, then the more disillusioned that I had become. I got to the age of, when I turned about 18 and had left school, and I started going to one of the colleges, and I was doing a business course, and I'd gone through that, because I was still coming to church, I was still going to meetings, and there was still this war that was taking place, because I knew God is the only one that can do something, but at the same time, He's not interested in me. What am I going to do? And at the age of 18, I started going to the college and doing a business course, and that opened up a kind of a new world to me, because at that stage then, there's nobody there that is Christians, and everybody does their work in the local pub that was just around the corner. And this is where it kind of became a bit crazy for me, because everybody's sitting there, they've got a pint, and we're doing our coursework and our research and stuff like that there. And I would still sit with a glass of Coke or with a glass of Sprite, because I still had a certain amount of morality to my life. I still had this belief and this conviction that maybe God will do something. And in the hope that, that I didn't want to mess anything up. I didn't want to do anything that would kind of cause God to say, no, that's it, it's definitely finished. But I still had this certain amount of morality, and there were these doors that were beginning to open then. Birthday parties and being able to go to a club. I mean, I've only been to a club, like, you can count on one hand the amount of times that I've been out to clubs. Because whenever I would go for a birthday party or go and hang out with some of these guys, it wasn't a place where I wanted to be. It was definitely not a place. Whenever I went in, I knew God's not in this place. This is not a place where I want to end up. In spite of all the lights and the music and everything, the fun and games and stuff like that there, I knew this is not good. And so this war continued. Okay, God, I'm going to church. I'm going to the meetings. I'm going up to get prayed for. And you're still silent. And I've had this opportunity to go off and to start drinking and to get involved in parties and go here, there, and everywhere. I'm over 18. I can do whatever I want. And yet there was still this conviction that I had within me not to go down that road. And my trust began to fail even more and began to wane even more. We started a business called the Name Factory. The first place we were in was over in Conswater. And we set up was these personalized pictures, and set up this stall over in Conswater and made a killing in our first few months. But whenever we were there were these people that we met that were already working there, and we met this guy. He had like these curtains. You remember curtains? I had curtains as well, but his were like bleach blonde. It was just ridiculous looking. Do you remember what happened with that guy? He worked in lifestyle sport. Oh yeah, you married him. That's right. Yeah, you married him. Yeah. I remember standing at the stall, and there was this girl who worked in bay trading, long blonde hair, and she came walking down. And my two friends, their jaws hit the ground at this girl, and she asked me out. And they were raging. But I remember, I'll tell you why I'm telling you this story in just a second. I remember we were like probably 18, 19 at the time. And we become good friends. And she'd asked me out, and she wasn't a Christian. And again, this war then begins to war within me. Because whenever she asked me out, I couldn't believe it. Like, what? And then there was this one part of me was like, yeah, go for it. And then this other part of me that was like, no, you cannot go down this road. I remember sitting with her, went out for coffee, and I says, listen, I can't do this, can't go down this road. And what I realized was that everything, the decisions that I was making, I was preparing myself for leaving church. And what I was actually doing was I was building my case to leave church. And what I realized was that the whole reason why I didn't start the drinking, the whole reason why I didn't start to go out to the parties, and the whole reason why I wouldn't date this girl was because I was preparing a case that I would take to God. And I would say, okay, God, I didn't do this. I could have, but I didn't. I didn't do this. I could have, but I didn't. And I didn't do this when I could have, but I didn't. And yet you're still silent. And I was making it all about me and the decisions that I was making, which were good decisions, but for the wrong motives. I'd come to a point in my life at the age of 19, I was going away to Canada. And I'd made a decision that that's me. I have made my case before God. I'm done with church. And it was in Canada in 1995 that God just revolutionized my life. And I went to someone who was done with God and was finished with God, who had no longer any trust in God, that God was interested in him, that God loved him, that God cared for him, and I was done. And I came back on fire for God, trusting in God. He met with me. He met with me. Sometimes the problem isn't necessarily in the fact that stuff goes wrong in our lives as Christians. Sometimes it's the fact that it just doesn't seem to end. Because my story went on for a number of years before God eventually spoke. And I'm like, God, why did it take 4 to 5 years? I know why. Not get into it at the minute, but there is a process that we need to go through, that God is preparing us for what he has called us to. And I needed to trust him. Even in those dark times, I needed to trust him. You see, trust is the most difficult thing about trust. What makes trust so hard and so difficult is that trust is you giving total and complete control of a situation over to someone else. And that's a difficult thing to do. Anybody ever come to you with the words, trust me? Do we have that picture? This for me is kind of like a picture that speaks more of trust than anything. Because at some point we will have probably either been standing on top of a wall when a parent or an older one has been saying, jump, trust me. Or maybe we've been the one that has been saying to a child, trust me. And what we're asking the child to do is give me control of this situation. That's what trust is. Trust is giving complete and total control of a particular situation over to someone else so that you have absolutely no control whatsoever. That's what trust is. When someone comes to you and they say, will you trust me? Trust me. They're saying, give me complete and total control, and you don't have any. And as a child jumps from a wall, there's this moment where complete control is handed over to someone else. And as Christians, that's what we're called to do, to give complete control over to God. Trust also means that we don't know. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't always know what's happening. Sometimes we want to take control back, because to not have control is a scary place to be, a frightening place to be. Giving someone else control, giving someone else complete control over our lives, even if it's God, is sometimes difficult to do. But that's what God is calling us to. God is calling us to develop a culture of trust with him. And that's what it means, in Proverbs chapter 3, is to put our whole trust in him with our whole heart and not to depend on ourselves, not to try and figure it out, not to try and understand what's going on, but just to say, God, I give you complete control. Take it. It's yours. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I don't know what the end is going to be. I trust you with it. I trust you with it. When the disciples are on the boat and Jesus comes walking on the water over to the disciples, and Peter climbs out of the boat. He says, Jesus, call me over to yourself. And Jesus calls Peter out of the boat to walk on water with him. And Peter gets out of the boat and he begins to walk on water. An impossible thing to happen unless you cheat, like the guy did in the Thames, whatever his name is. Some of you thought he really did walk on water. Peter gets out of the boat because he has trust in Jesus. But as he's walking on water, what begins to happen is the wind begins to rise up and the waves begin to rise up around him. You see, whenever you take a step of faith, we think, I take a step of faith, then everything's going to be brilliant, everything's going to be good. Whenever you take a step of faith, there is going to be opposition to your steps of faith. Sometimes what happens then is we take that step of faith and it seems like we're walking on water, and then something comes in and hits us for six, and it seems like it just continually bashes against us, and we begin to sink because we begin to look at the circumstances and we take our eyes off Jesus Christ, the author, the finisher of our faith, and we begin to lose trust in him. It amazes me how so many people become Christians as a result of a bad circumstance, as a result of a sickness coming into a family, or something negative and something bad happens, and people think, I need God in my life, which is a great thing. But then it also amazes me how many Christians can be coming to church and then something bad happens and they walk away from God. That moment whenever they need to wholly depend and trust on God, and they don't, and they leave. They leave. Peter, in some way, failed because he took his eyes off Christ and he began to look at his circumstances. Began to look at the things around him. In Hebrews chapter 11, see, trust and faith go hand in hand. In Hebrews chapter 11, it says, now faith is the evidence, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Trust and faith requires that you don't know. And that is so difficult. As we give control of a circumstance or a situation over to someone else, it means that we don't know what they're going to do. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so the writer of Hebrews is saying faith is the substance of things hoped for. We haven't yet achieved it. We haven't yet reached it. We can't fully see it. But it's the evidence of things not yet seen. So faith requires us to have this trust in God. And we don't see the outcome. We don't know what's going to happen. And again, that's a difficult thing to live through. That's a difficult thing to accomplish and to achieve, is to give God complete and total trust. Especially when something's happening in our lives and it's messing us up, and we're crying out to God for God to do something, and it seems like he's silent. And it's in those moments that God is saying, just trust me. Just trust me. See, once we begin to take control back, then that's not trust. Sometimes we'll give God so much rope, and then we'll pull a wee bit back in again. We give God so much, and then we take a little bit back again. because we're afraid to give complete and total control over to God, and that is a lack of trust, church. And God is saying, I need you to trust me. I need you to trust me with your job. I need you to trust me with your finances. I need you to trust me with that sickness. I need you to trust me with the circumstances that are going on that you don't understand, that you can't get your head around, but I need you to trust me. I've been reading the story of Job, and you know, you ever read the life of Job? My goodness, no matter how many times I read it, it's kind of like you struggle to kind of get your head around what just happened there. Job is this, he's described as the most wealthiest man in the land at his time. I mean, you talk in modern day language, he would be a multi-billionaire probably. I mean, wealth that you could, you know, just ridiculous amounts of wealth. People would come to him, they would look up to him, and they would come to him for advice. They would come to him for counsel. They would come to him for wisdom. They had struggles, and people would go to Job and say, Job, I'm struggling with this. I need advice on this. Job was the man. Job was the man. Job has had this belief that with some of his friends that if you did good in life, then God would bless you. So Job's belief was the reason that I'm so wealthy is because I'm such a good person. That if I do wrong in life, if I sin, then this will all be taken away from me. That was what he believed, along with a lot of his friends. And lo and behold, everything is taken from Job. The crazy thing is that it's kind of the result of a bet between God and the devil. It's a result of a wager. Because the devil is like, yeah, I can break Job. And God's like, no, you can't. He'll still continue to trust me. And the devil's like, well, let's bet on it then, you know. Let's prove it and see what's happening. And so God gives the devil permission to attack Job. That messes up with a lot of people's theology right there. And Job, who believed all of this stuff, that I'm wealthy because I'm good, begins to mess with his theology. It's kind of like my theology. God, I haven't done this when I could have. Therefore, you owe me. How messed up is that? And what happens is Job he's like the most wealthiest man in the land, and everything, I mean everything is gone. He is penniless. It's gone. His family are dead. He takes on this sickness where he's covered in boils. The only one of his family that's left and remaining is his wife, and his wife's advice is to curse God and die. Job's response is, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. See, Job didn't understand, because Job knew in his heart, in his mind, in his soul, he knew, I haven't sinned. I haven't done anything for this to happen to me. So Job couldn't get his head around why this was taking place. Why has my family died? Why have my businesses gone bankrupt? Why have all my animals died? Why am I homeless? Why am I covered in boils? He didn't understand, and his friends are coming in and they're saying, Job, it's obvious you have sinned. Just admit it. Just own up to it. You've sinned. And Job's like, no, I haven't. God was teaching Job a lesson about his grace, about his mercy, about that, you know, his messed up beliefs, his messed up theology is about grace and about God's favor, and that what you have is not because you're a good person. Sometimes we diminish the blessings of God to nothing more than big cars and houses. People think because they drive a big car that they're blessed of God, or that they live in a big house that they're... I'm not disagreeing with that yeah, that can be a blessing of God, but that's not... No. You can be as poor as I don't know who, and yet still be abundantly blessed by God. And Job had a turnaround, but his response is amazing. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And because he continued to trust in God, He had a turnaround, and God taught him a lesson. God was teaching him, and out of that experience, Job ended up with more wealth than what he had before. Stronger and better theology than what he had before. Because his response was, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Same stuff happened with Joseph. Will be finished in just a few minutes. Joseph has this dream given by God, and it's a dream that he's going to be in a position of some kind of authority. And he shares his dream with his brothers and his mother and father, and his brothers obviously don't take a liking to the dreams that he's having. And they make this plan to kill Joseph. They see him coming in the distance as they're out watching the sheep, and they see him coming in the distance, and they make a plan. Let's kill this dreamer. And they take him and they end up throwing him into a pit, and then they, rather than kill him, they sell him off into slavery. And for years, Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, ends up in Potiphar's house, and there he is lied about. He gets accused of rape, gets accused of something that he hasn't done, and he's imprisoned. And I can imagine Joseph, because I can imagine my response. I can imagine my response if I was Job. And it probably wouldn't be, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. It would probably be something completely different. I would be making my case before God. This is why I'm leaving you. And Joseph stays faithful to the call of God on his life until it comes to a point. You got to imagine, can you figure out, can you fully appreciate what Joseph is going through, because he's in prison. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't do anything to deserve to be sold into slavery. He didn't do anything to be imprisoned. All he did was have a God-given dream. And as a result of that, his life gets messed up, yet he still trusts in God, in that good Father, until it comes to a point where he is eventually released from prison, and he is elevated to second in command in Egypt. And his brothers turn up on the scene, and he's able to say to his brothers, guys, don't worry about it. Don't sweat it, don't stress it, because it wasn't you, it was God. God did this. God sent me ahead of you. God had a plan and a purpose. The Apostle Paul could say the same thing. The Apostle Paul, called of God. I mean, what a transformation that takes place. I often speak with people who aren't Christians, and a lot of times, sometimes they'll say to me, if I have the same experience that the Apostle Paul has, then I'll become a Christian. And Paul, who was Saul at the time, he's on the road to Damascus, and he's going to arrest Christians, to imprison them, to beat them, to even have them killed. And he has this amazing transformation on the road to Damascus as God shows up, and he gets blinded and has this amazing conversion experience. But you kind of be thinking, after answering God's calling on your life, and you're traveling around the known world at that time, and you're preaching the gospel, and you're establishing churches, and you're seeing people saved, and you're seeing people healed, and you would think that would be enough for God to in some way come in and make it easier. And yet Paul is able to write about the amount of times that he's been beaten up, the amount of times that he's been put in prison, the amount of times that he's been whipped and stoned and shipwrecked and left for dead. And yet Paul continually sets his face towards the next stage and the next step of his journey, and turns his attention to Rome, knowing that in Rome he's going to be killed, knowing that in Rome he's going to be martyred. These men trusted God. In spite of the years where it seemed like it was all going wrong, they still trusted God. They had developed this culture of trust. Worship team, come please. You see, we will never always know everything. And that's where trust has got to count. We will never fully know. We will never fully understand. We will see a little piece of the jigsaw puzzle, but God sees the whole picture. And that's what he's working towards. That's why we can trust him, because God sees the end from the beginning, and he's working to a plan and to a purpose, and he knows what he's doing. That's why we can trust him. Sometimes in those dark moments, we will struggle to trust him, and I'm telling you today, church, trust him. Trust him with everything you've got. Trust him. When it's all getting messed up and whenever it's all going wrong, trust him. You will not know. Like Noah. Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen. Not yet seen. Moved with godly fear and prepared an ark for the saving of his household. Noah didn't know what an ark was. These people hadn't even really seen rain, let alone a flood. And yet God calls him to build an ark. Never seen any of these things before. And yet Noah continued to trust God in those years of building that ark. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to a place which he would receive as an inheritance. And as he went out, not knowing where he was going, God's calling Abraham and he says, I want you to leave here and I want you to go here. Abraham didn't know anything else. He didn't know the next stage or the stage after that. And we want to have everything all mapped out for us. The next 10 stages of life. Abraham was given it one stage at a time. But he left the comfort of where he was. And he went to somewhere that he had never been before. To a land he'd never seen before. Because he trusted God. Even with Isaac, he trusted God. He trusted. As he led Isaac on that altar and he was about to sacrifice Isaac, he didn't know what was going to happen because Abraham was old. I mean old. Sarah was old. And this was the son of promise. And Abraham, I'm sure, was maybe thinking, you know what? If he dies, you know, I'm still going to trust you. Because you've done it once before, so I'm going to trust you again. And he trusted God with Isaac. God's calling us to trust him, church. To trust him. He's in control. We can trust him. And in spite of all the messes and the sickness and the stuff that we go through in life, we'll feel in comparison to what God will have stored up for us in eternity. God's got all of eternity to make it up to you, church. What a change that's going to be. What a change that's going to be in eternity. No more sickness, no more sorrow, no more death, no more grieving. God will make it up to you. He's calling us to trust him. God is for you. He is devoted to you. He is actually more for you than what you are for yourself. He is a faithful God who works to a plan and to a purpose through a process. He sees the whole picture, we see just a little bit. Very often we tend to make decisions based on a tiny bit of information. We make decisions, big life decisions, based on one little piece of the jigsaw. God sees the whole picture. He sees the whole jigsaw puzzle. He has made a covenant with you. He's made a covenant with you. And he has sealed that covenant by pledging himself to you. Sealed it with the shedding of his own blood and the sacrifice of the Son of Jesus Christ. He's invested his life in you, and you can trust him. And what he wants to do now is he wants to move us spiritually forward, trusting in him. He wants to move us from comfort zones into deeper waters, from probably standing on the banks where it's safe and where it's secure, and moving us into deeper waters where our feet won't touch the bottom. But it's a call to trust him. so that we don't have any control. Our feet won't touch the bottom, and at the bottom, that's where there's control. And God's saying, no, come into the deeper waters with me. Come into the deeper waters and trust me with your life. Trust me with your circumstances. He's calling us into deeper waters. He's calling us to trust him in the next stage of our process. He's wanting to move us like Abraham from one stage to the next stage. Will you trust him, church? He's calling some of you like he called Noah to do something new, to do something different, something that you've never done before. And he's calling you, church. He's calling you to move. He's calling you to go deeper. He's calling you like he called Peter out of a boat, calling you to walk on water with him, calling you to trust him with the next stage and with the next purpose. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Because those that wait on the Lord, those whose hope is in the Lord, those who trust in the Lord, those who trust in the Lord shall renew their strength. They will mount up with wings as eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and they will not faint. Will you trust in church? You must stand to your feet. You must stand to your feet. Let's trust him today, church.